We're outside the village of Cologne in northern France. Major George S. Bowerbank watches his men of the Canadian 21st Battalion force down their first hot meal in 2 weeks. Back home, Bowerbank is an accountant from Sarnia, Ontario, a man of ledgers and quiet routine. But for nearly 3 years now, he has been a soldier here on the Western Front, twice decorated for his gallantry in the roar of open battle. But tonight, he would lead his men into a different kind of war. In just a few hours, he and his men would execute what was designed to be the most ambitious, most meticulously planned trench raid of the entire First World War. Crouched in their cramped, dark dugout, some of the men were far too nervous to eat. Despite all the planning that had gone into the raid, there was no denying that there was a lot of moving parts. It would only take one misstep for everything to go horribly wrong. They began to check their gear. This morning they'd have little use for the standard issued Ross rifle. Instead, they were arming themselves for close, brutal work. A sharpened shovel, a trench knife in a boot, a heavily nailed club hanging from a belt. Tools designed to lacerate flesh and crush bone without making a sound. A soldier takes a piece of burnt cork and blackens his face, smearing away his identity until only a phantom remains. Outside, a freezing chill wrapped itself around the village of Cologne. Bowerbank checks his watch. It's 0430, time to move. They need to be in position by 0715. For him and his men, that meant crawling silently through hundreds of yards of mud, wire, and the rotting corpses of men and horses. It's now 0744, 1 minute to 0 hour. Bowerbank and his men have made it into their positions, and for one agonizing hour have lain perfectly still in the frozen mud. Just 50 yards away, they can see the dark slash of a German trench. Unsuspecting sentries silhouetted against the pale dawn move about their routines completely unaware of the 860 phantoms that are watching them from the dark and dirt. Major Bowerbank, now ignoring his watch, waits for the final signal to move. Not a whistle, not a shout, but a tremor coming from deep within the earth itself. At 0745, precisely on time, he feels it. A deep, hollow boom, a mile or so to the north. The sappers had blown the diversionary mine designed to draw the majority of German fire away from his position. Bowerbank knows that this is the moment. With his heart pounding in a suffocating silence, he gives his men the signal, and they rise as one, gripping their crude, brutal weapons as they surge forward towards the German trench. The next 30 minutes will be the most intense of Bowerbank's life, and the last for dozens of the men following his lead. When we picture World War I, this is often what we see. An alien landscape of mud and wire that stretched from the English Channel to the Alps. It was a war defined by stalemate, monotony, and impersonality, and in the steadfast belief that the defensive power of the machine gun and the trench had made the attack impossible. This belief, tragically, proved true again and again at battles like the Somme, Verdun, and Passchendaele, where hundreds of thousands of men were torn to pieces in no man's land. Major Bowerbank and the men from the 20th and 21st Canadian Battalion were at the sharp end of a new type of warfare designed to break the deadlock: the trench raid. But to understand why Bowerbank and his men were lying silently in that frozen hell on the 17th of January 1917, we first have to understand the geography of the Western Front. You see, much of Belgium and Flanders, where the Canadian Corps fought its battles, consisted of low ridges and wide expanses of flat, open terrain. Any natural cover like forests had been quickly reduced to a collection of burnt stumps by continuous shelling and machine gun fire. Now there was nowhere left to hide, and soldiers were forced to dig themselves into the ground to survive. The result, as we know, was a complex, interlocking network of trenches. A typical trench was around 6 to 8 feet deep and around 4 to 6 feet wide, dug in a zigzagging pattern so that any explosion or machine gun couldn't fire straight down its length. Connecting them were smaller trenches designed to support anything from communications, ammunition dumps, or even machine gun or snipers' nests. Between the two armies lay a desolate, cratered strip of ground that became known as No Man's Land. At first, this was covered in barbed wire entanglements that were only a few rows deep, but soon wire was placed on top of damaged wire, which was placed on top of damaged wire, creating a thick entanglement of murderous rusted steel. The Germans, often holding the better ground, built their defences to last. Their trench systems were frequently more complex and better constructed than the Allied lines, containing deep, elaborate dugouts, concrete bomb stores, and perfectly camouflaged sniping posts. They had also spent 3 years perfecting the science of defensive warfare. In 1914, a German infantry company was supported by just a handful of machine guns. By 1917, however, that number had tripled. They had integrated machine gun, sharpshooter detachments and platoons of trench mortars directly into their infantry battalions. They had learned to abandon a lightly held front line to an attacker, only to annihilate them in the flank with an overlapping arc of fire from these hardened positions. They believed that with these tactics, they could repel any attack. The Canadians were about to prove them wrong. It was in this static deadlock that the trench raid was born. It originated as part of a British High Command policy to maintain what they called offensive esprit de corps, in essence, boosting morale through attack. While the French observed an unofficial truce when not in a major battle, the British, in the words of the official record, emphasised the necessity for continual aggressiveness. For the commanders, raids were a tool to combat the morbid monotony of trench warfare. They kept the enemy nervous and edgy, and they reminded their own men that their job was not just to survive, but to fight. For these soldiers, it was a chance to stop just waiting for death in the mud and instead meet it head on. Many volunteered to join raiding parties. Their missions would vary wildly. Some were sent to kill silently, others to capture prisoners or gather intelligence before slipping away into the night, all before enemy reinforcements could arrive. Others, like those in the attack at Cologne, were part of a larger, coordinated assault. Either way, to be a trench raider was to court death in ways that no frontline soldier could ever imagine. These men blackened their faces with cork and slipped through the night like phantoms. They avoided guns wherever possible, fearing that noise would give them away, instead equipping themselves with a variety of melee weapons that wouldn't look out of place on a medieval battlefield. Most carried homemade clubs carved from wood and reinforced with nails. Others favoured trench knives or bayonets, even sharpened entrenching tools. Some even carried brass knuckles or axes lashed to broom handles. Once the cat was out of the bag, however, and noise was no longer an issue, grenades, Stokes bombs, and gun cotton were the weapons of choice. They could destroy a dugout and emplacements in seconds, or send a retaliating force ducking for cover while the raiders made their escape. The trench raid was by no means a Canadian invention, but as historian Daniel G. Dancox once wrote, if the Canadians had not initiated this form of warfare, they certainly elevated it to an art form. The first Canadian raid, a small affair by the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry in February 1915, was just the beginning. The Canadian staff quickly realised the tactical advantages of raiding. A successful raid could yield huge rewards: prisoners for interrogation, documents for intelligence, and the chance to map out enemy defences. Through these raids, the Allies quickly learned to unravel the German defensive web by breaking it apart piece by piece. And as the tactics evolved, so did the raids themselves. They grew in size, from a few dozen men of a single infantry battalion to almost 1,000 troops from all arms. What began as an ad hoc squad of phantoms in the night evolved into an elite professional formation conducting large-scale combined arms warfare. By the time Major Bowerbank led his first raid near Cologne in 1917, trench raids had evolved to the cutting edge of modern warfare. But no matter how practiced or how precise the planning, raiding an enemy trench remained one of the most personal and brutal and perilous acts a soldier could undertake. It's now 07:46, and all hell is breaking out along the German lines. As Bowerbank and his troops surged forwards across the frozen ground, a barrage of smoke slammed into the German front line, creating a perfect smokescreen. But the Germans were not entirely silent. The crackle of machine gun fire spit from the trench, the rounds zipping through the smoke-filled air. The fire, however, was panicked and ultimately ineffective. Thanks to the diversionary attack by the Canadian 18th and 19th Battalions to the north, most of the German fire was directed elsewhere. This is where the first part of their training paid off. The prior weeks spent prowling after dark in no man's land and memorising the terrain allowed the raiders to reach their entry points in the German trenches with flawless accuracy. Within moments, troops from the first wave, covered in snow, poured over the parapet and dropped silently into the German trench. The scene that met them was one of utter chaos. To the terrified Germans, the zigzagging trench now became a maze of smoke, explosions, and ghosts appearing from nowhere. But for the Canadians, it was familiar ground. This was the brutal choreography they had practiced for weeks on a full-scale, perfect replica of these very trenches, built behind their own lines. They knew every turn, every dugout, every blind corner, and this knowledge allowed them to move ruthlessly through the mayhem. There was no time for the considered aim of a rifle here. The work was done at arm's length. A raider would round a zigzagged corner and come face to face with a terrified German. The fight would be over in a second with the swing of a heavy, nail-studded club or the thrust of a bayonet. It was primal. It was savage. But this was not just random violence. It was a planned, scientific savagery. Every platoon was a combined arms in miniature. While some men engaged in hand-to-hand combat, specialized bombers moved through the trenches, tossing Mills bombs into the deep German dugouts. The key to breaking the German defense systems lay with the engineers, or the sappers. Men like Sapper H. Arnold and T. Connolly of the 4th Field Company. Weighted down by cumbersome ladders and heavy gun-cotton charges, their job was to follow the initial wave and neutralize hardened positions. They would throw their ladders across German communication trenches, creating bridges for the second wave to follow before moving on to the main task, placing their satchel charges against concrete machine gun nests and deep dugouts, lighting the fuse and diving for cover. For 30 frantic minutes, this brutal work continued. The first wave, blood-spattered and exhausted, became the anchor point as the second wave of fresh Canadians passed through them. Some Germans fled into the darkness of the communication trenches, others, petrified, refused to leave their shelters and were simply blown apart by the Mills bombs. When the whistle finally blew, the withdrawal began. A frantic reversal, dragging the weight of dead and wounded comrades and hauling dazed, bleeding prisoners back towards the safety of the British and Canadian lines. As a golden sun crested the horizon to the east, the scene of devastation left by Bowerbank and his men became apparent. The official tallies provide the cold, hard evidence of their effectiveness. 40 dugouts were blown to hell. 2 German machine guns and 2 trench mortars were captured. 3 ammunition dumps were destroyed. The Canadians counted 32 Germans dead, plus a large unknown number killed in the obliterated dugouts. And most importantly for intelligence, over 100 German prisoners were taken back to the Canadian lines. But victory on the Western Front was always paid for in blood. The butcher's bill for the Canadians was steep: 40 men killed and 135 wounded. Major Bowerbank's company alone suffered nearly 25% casualties. Yet amid this loss was a fierce testament to their code of honour. In the frantic withdrawal through the mud and the fire and the smoke, not a single Canadian, dead or alive, was left behind. For his leadership through the chaos, Major George Bowerbank, the accountant from Sarnia, was awarded the Military Cross. For their courage in the brutal close-quarters fighting, Sergeant Thomas Galbraith and Private William Carrera earned the Military Medal. That same medal was awarded to the sapper team, H. Arnold and T. Connolly, who had systematically wrecked the German defences with their ladders and satchel charges. The bravery of these men, who fought in unimaginable and terrifying conditions, proved that the formidable German defence in-depth system could be broken. It proved that meticulous, obsessive rehearsal on full-scale models of enemy trenches could work. And it proved that empowering small battalions with their own bombers, riflemen and engineers, what we now call combined arms tactics, was the key to unravelling the enemy trench network. These new principles formed the blueprint for a new way of war. They were the tactics that could prove instrumental in shattering the stalemate of the trenches, leading to the iconic Canadian victory at the Battle of Vimy Ridge in April, a few months later. The raid transformed the Canadian Corps from a colonial contingent into the shock troops of the entire British Expeditionary Force, a reputation forged in the dark and in the mud, and in the savagery of the trench raid. A reputation built by men like George Bowerbank, ordinary men who were asked to trade their quiet routines for trench clubs and who perfected a brutal new arithmetic of war, one that would ultimately change the course of history. Thank you for watching this episode of Raw History, where we explored the amazing and brutal tactics of the trench raid through the eyes of those who took part in them. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments. What would you be thinking in a trench raid, and what do you want me to cover next? Let me know, and I'll see you in the next one.